So today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of transition from looking at a single article to now steps that we're going to take to evaluate more than one research article. And so if you think about our CAP paper as just that, a single abbreviated written for us evaluation of that one article, that gives us some information, but usually we're going to try to include more than one research article, right? We want to get as much research as is applicable. Given that, then, we're going to need to start to have ways to compare different research articles. And we talked about that a little bit when we talked about critiquing and critically appraising stuff, when we talked about levels of evidence and types of study and the applicability of the study. And if you remember, one of the things that I said we would talk about later was this Pedro score. And so now's the time we're going to talk about this. What the Pedro score is it is a way to judge the quality of randomized control trials. Now, when I say judge the quality, I want you to always keep in mind that the number one aspect of the quality of a study is going to be the type of study that it is. So there are certain situations when randomization or blinding are not going to be appropriate or not possible. So low scores or different types of study doesn't mean that they're bad. All that that means is that we have more possibility for confounding variables. So we can't just throw out cohort studies. We can't throw out studies that are just blinded and all that. But we're looking for ways to assess the internal validity in a numerical way. This also goes into the external validity a little bit, but that isn't scored. And then the statistical validity just has 2 questions. So what this is, if you were able to read that, research article that I posted, that describes what this scale was made to do and like how it was assessed. But now we're going to look at how to do it. And so I posted this as just an in-class reading. It's the Pedro score. I'm going to ask you in your synthesis assignment as well as your systematic review to assess the Pedro score. And the Pedro score is from 0 to 10, and it's just the number. And it's the number of yes answers, with the exception of number 1 is not scored. Right? There are 11 questions, but number 1 is not scored. And the reason number 1 is not scored is because, like I said, eligibility criteria is really going to be more about external validity than internal validity. So 2 through 9 talk about internal validity. 10 and 11 talk about statistical validity. So as you did your CAP paper, right, you were analyzing these sorts of things and noting them. Now we're just going to score them. Okay, So the way you use this scale is the administration is on the back and the scores are on the front. All you have to do is take the research article that you're reading. So if we went back and did the Pedro score on that research article we just did, we could give it a score. And so we can use that a little bit as examples. So the first one, eligibility criteria, were specified. If you remember, that was obviously yes in that article, but that's not scored. So usually with that, I just don't even put anything there because it screws me up when I'm counting. And I'm just not that smart. So let's go to number 2. Subjects were randomly allocated to groups. In a crossover study, subjects were randomly allocated in order in which treatments were received. Okay, so crossover studies are similar to what the study we did, we read before, where they participated in both groups. So with that, we need to see whether or not they were randomized. And so when we read the criteria here, it states that a study is considered to have used random allocation if the report states the allocation was random, the precise method of randomization not need be specified. Quasi-randomization, right, with that does not count. So if you go back, then we're going to go back to the methods and look and say, does it say, in this case, since it's a crossover study, that subjects were randomly allocated the order? And I don't remember, but I think it was. Right? And so you would just mark yes, and you could put where it occurred. Yeah, so it'd be like paragraph 2 of methods or something like that. The where isn't as important unless you're like comparing these between people. So 3 is allocation was concealed. So this is that if we go and look at the description here, concealed allocation means that the person who determined if a subject was eligible for inclusion in the trial was unaware when this decision was made of what group the subject would be allocated to. So what this means is if I am enrolling Nick into this study, when I'm questioning him and doing the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria and trying to decide whether or not he fits the criteria for this, I do not know what group he will be in. And the obvious reason for this would be if there, if group randomization was to occur, but it had already like pre-occurred, which sometimes happens with that, I would know what group he would be in. And then I would, try to fudge if I thought he would be a good candidate for this drug or this intervention, then I put him in. If he's in the experimental group, maybe I keep him out if he's in the control group, stuff like that. So all it has to do is state that, all I have to do is state that at that time, it was unaware. Right? A point is awarded for this criteria, even if it's not stated the allocation was concealed when the report states the allocation was sealed by opaque envelopes or allocation involved contacting the holder of the allocation was scheduled was offsite. So this idea that they still get a point even if they don't specifically state that, but in this case, they're using some other method. Usually this is a decent one where they get the point for that because that's pretty blatant disregard of ethical standards with that. Is this making sense at all? It's fairly simple. All the instructions are there. Go through some of these a little bit faster now because it's easier. Groups were similar at baseline regarding the most important prognostic indicators. And so this is where we were talking about randomization is great with the groups, but it's not perfect. If for some reason there's some weirdness that occurs and the groups are different at baseline, right, then they wouldn't get this point. And that would obviously show a decrease in the internal validity. Blinding, we talked about blinding, and this is, if there was ever a critique of the Pedro score, and this is just one method of doing it, it's the most common that I've seen in the literature, so that's why we do it. But if there was any critique of the score, it's the fact that 3 of these are all blinding. So 3 of the 10 points are all based on blinding. So if blinding's not possible, then the score is automatically going to go down. So blinding of the subjects, meaning that the subjects don't know what group they're in. 6 is blinding of the therapists. 7 is blinding of the assessors. So obviously, if it states that they're blinded, that's great. But you can also award the point if it's reasonably expected that they would have been unable to distinguish between the treatments. So with that, even if they say there's blinding or something, but you feel like they would know for whatever reason, that's where you can have a debate on this. But really it comes down to, do they know what sort of group they're in? And the easiest or the biggest problems with blinding or threats to blinding would be, 1, if participants in different groups were able to speak or perform the experiment at the same period of time, because then they would easily be able to compare. Or if one section is an administration of a treatment and the other is just a pure control where they just sit there. Right? Those are the 2 main times when blinding was not performed. So going back to Nick, if Nick's participating in the study and he's in the treatment procedure, and so I have him, wearing the wrist, cooling device that I was talking about before, and then somebody else is next to him and they don't have the bracelet on, then they would obviously be able to tell. This is usually when there's some form of either standardization or some sort of blinding placebo type application, where we would put other individuals in the bracelet thing, but not turn it on, something like that. 8 is pretty self-explanatory. You have to record at least 8 of the, or record at least 85% of the measures in one of the key outcomes. So this has to do with drop rate. If for whatever reason there was a difference in drop rate, meaning that people were more likely to drop off in one study, or there was just a lot of people dropping out of the study, that would be a threat, because now usually people that aren't getting better or aren't seeing results are more likely to drop. All subjects for whom outcome measures were available received the treatment or control condition as allocated for. All right, so again, neither have to do with drop. Is there anything particularly? So intention to treat is a very specific type of study. We probably don't deal with that very often because it usually has to do with more serious conditions where you have to do something. right, where a true control would not be appropriate. 10 results of, and then now we get into statistical validity. Results of between group statistics comparison are reported for at least one key outcome. Right? I mean, I've never seen a study that didn't get awarded that point. And the study provides both point measures and measures of variability for at least one key outcome. And that is those standard deviations, confidence intervals, standard errors, different things like that are reported. Right? Again, the back page here describes the different categorizations. The front page is the scale. So each article that you would include in your research project would include a Pedro scale or Pedro score. As such, right, that gives the reader an ability to quickly ascertain the internal validity of the study, which, if you remember, is the ability of the study to be true to itself and do what it says it does. This has nothing to do with external validity, because external validity is very much situation specific. A research article could be, have very high external validity to one research, somebody that's using that, one reader, and very low to the next reader. But the internal validity applies across all the readership. Questions on Pedro score or how to do that? Where would you put that in, like, your... So where you would include like level of evidence, so it'd be like, usually it's just in parentheses, and it would just be, level of evidence 1A, Pedro equals 8, and just in parentheses. And that's a good question, because one thing to keep in mind with this, as we continue to write, and in our next assignment, you will have a word cap, which I'm sure is the first time you will ever have a word cap. The idea that you have to write, but you only have a certain number of words to get it done in, right? The opposite of usually what you're trying to do. And so things like that. Anytime we can put things and use numbers, in this case, like the Pedro score, to decrease the number of words that we would use, we want to. All right, so like instead of describing the entire internal validity, which would take however long it took in your CAP papers, we're just going to give it the Pedro score and the level of evidence. And in fact, we usually throw that into another sentence in which it's applicable. So if I was going to make a statement that said that, research has stated that, or research has found, or whatever, something like that, that this occurred, right? I just state that, right? It would be an external fan decreases physiological response in exercising in the heat, right? I just state that. That's a statement that's based off of this research. So I would then cite it, and after the citation, I could put level of evidence, Pedro score. And the idea with that is I can eliminate then all of the, Wingo et al. Statements, the I feel statements, the I think statements, and just state it with my background being that this article did it, and this is the qualifications of this article. And we'll talk more about how to do that when we do our synthesis assignment on Wednesday. Other questions?